At 7:34 in the morning on Monday, August 10th, 2026, the ground beneath western Colombia tore open with a force the country hadn't felt in over a decade. A magnitude 7. 4 earthquake struck near the small municipality of San José del Palmar in the department of Chocó, roughly 150 miles west of Bogota, and within seconds, the shaking had rippled outward across 9 departments and all 32 provincial capitals, rattling neighboring Ecuador and Panama as well. In the city of Pereira, in the heart of what Colombians call the coffee axis, apartment towers folded in on themselves in real time, captured on geolocated video that would circulate around the world within hours. In Cali, the country's 3rd largest city, search teams and ordinary civilians formed human chains through the rubble, passing broken concrete hand to hand while loved ones stood by watching, waiting, hoping. In Manizales, one of the side towers of the city's landmark neo-Gothic cathedral sheared off and crashed into the streets below. As of the most recent official tally, more than 200 people are confirmed dead, well over 1,000 injured, and thousands more remain unaccounted for. Numbers that Colombian authorities have been explicit are provisional and likely to keep climbing as rescue crews finally reach villages that have been completely cut off since the moment the ground stopped shaking. This is a genuine, still unfolding national tragedy, and today we're going to walk through exactly what happened, the specific and unusual seismic mechanics that made this earthquake behave so differently from anything most of Colombia's history had prepared it for, how the response has unfolded in the hours and days since, and why a country that sits at one of the most geologically complicated crossroads on the planet now finds itself confronting hard questions about how prepared its cities actually were. If you find this kind of careful, fact-based breakdown valuable, go ahead and hit subscribe and drop a like. And if you're watching this because you have loved ones in the affected region, our thoughts are with you, and we'll do our best to lay out exactly what's known so far. Let's start with a human toll, because the numbers here have been moving quickly, and it's worth being precise about what's actually confirmed versus what's still emerging. In the earliest hours after the quake, Colombia's newly inaugurated president, Abelardo de la Espriella, sworn into office only the day before the disaster struck, gave a preliminary count of 111 dead and 87 injured. By that evening, the Colombian Association of Capital Cities was reporting 132 confirmed deaths and 570 injuries, including 60 fatalities in Pereira alone, the hardest hit city in the entire disaster zone. As search and rescue operations pushed further into the following day, that toll climbed again, past 160, then past 200, with the most recent comprehensive figures placing confirmed deaths above 220, injuries above 1,200, and more than 3,700 people still reported missing across the affected departments. A missing persons figure that officials have cautioned will take considerable time to resolve, since it includes both people genuinely trapped under debris and people simply unreachable because entire communities remained cut off from communication and access. President de la Espriella reported that an estimated 5,000 homes were damaged or destroyed nationwide. The Association of Capital Cities confirmed 86 buildings had collapsed outright, with hundreds more structurally compromised and awaiting engineering inspection before residents can safely return. 5 capital cities across the country, including Pereira, Cali, Manizales, Armenia, and Quibdó, were placed under red alert, Colombia's highest disaster classification, while 7 regional airports suspended operations entirely as engineers rushed to inspect runways and terminal buildings for structural damage before allowing flights to resume. Some of the individual scenes emerging from the disaster zone capture the scale of what's happening better than any statistic can. In Pereira, 16 people were trapped for 6 hours inside the cars of an aerial cable car system that serves as public transit across the city's hillside terrain, suspended in midair as rescue teams worked to reach them safely. In Cali, local officials confirmed at least 20 buildings had crumbled entirely and roughly 380 more sustained serious damage, trapping an unknown number of residents inside, with the city's mayor separately reporting that at least 188 people remained missing in Cali alone as rescue efforts continued. Alvaro Lopez, a resident who watched the search unfold outside his own damaged building, described the scene in stark terms, saying his building had basically been left in ruins, while the building right next to his had completely collapsed, a description echoed by countless residents across the affected region standing in the strange, disorienting position of watching their neighbors' homes reduced to rubble while their own still stood for now. Hallie Sherwood, a resident of Armenia, described widespread structural damage across her city, even in buildings that hadn't fully collapsed. The kind of hidden, harder to quantify destruction that engineering teams will spend weeks assessing building by building before anyone can say with confidence which structures are safe to reoccupy and which need to come down entirely. Now, let's get into the science, because this earthquake behaved in ways that genuinely surprised people, and understanding why helps explain both the scale of the destruction and, in a strange way, why it wasn't even more catastrophic than it was. Colombia sits at one of the most tectonically complicated locations on the entire planet, a place where three separate major plates, the Nazca Plate pushing in from the Pacific, the South American Plate beneath the continent itself, and the Caribbean Plate to the north, all interact and grind against each other, along with a smaller crustal fragment geologists call the North Andean Block, caught in the collision zone between them. Off Colombia's Pacific coast, the oceanic Nazca Plate, or in the more specific classification some researchers use for this exact stretch of boundary, a small microplate called the Malpelo Plate, immediately northeast of the main Nazca Plate, is being forced downward and eastward beneath the South American Plate along the Colombia-Ecuador Trench, at a rate of roughly 55 to 60 millimeters a year, among the faster subduction rates found anywhere on Earth. That's the same broad category of plate boundary responsible for some of history's most devastating earthquakes, including a magnitude 8. 8 event that ruptured a 500 to 600 kilometer stretch of this exact same interface back in 1906, one of the largest earthquakes ever recorded, and one that triggered a tsunami felt clear across the Pacific Ocean. But here's the detail that made this particular earthquake genuinely unusual, and it's the single most important piece of science for understanding why the destruction spread across such an enormous area, rather than concentrating narrowly around the epicenter. The August 10th earthquake did not occur at the shallow interface where the Nazca Plate meets the South American Plate, the kind of shallow interface-style rupture responsible for that historic 1906 event, and for most of the tsunami-generating earthquakes typically associated with this stretch of coastline. Instead, the United States Geological Survey placed this rupture at a depth of approximately 107 kilometers, more than 60 miles beneath the surface, occurring not at the boundary between the two plates, but deep within the descending slab of oceanic crust itself, as it continues sinking down into the mantle long after passing beneath the coastline. Seismologists classify earthquakes striking anywhere between roughly 70 and 300 kilometers deep as intermediate depth events, and they behave in a fundamentally different way from the shallow, near-surface earthquakes most people picture when they imagine a disaster like this. Because the rupture originates so far beneath the surface, the seismic energy has to travel through an enormous volume of rock before it ever reaches anyone standing on the ground above, and that long journey does two things simultaneously. It spreads the shaking out across a vastly larger geographic footprint than a shallow quake of the same magnitude ever could, which is exactly why this earthquake was felt strongly, not just across 9 Colombian departments, but in neighboring Ecuador and Panama as well, hundreds of kilometers from the epicenter. And at the same time, that same distance actually reduces the intensity of shaking directly above the rupture compared to what an equally powerful shallow earthquake would produce, which is a genuinely important, if counterintuitive, silver lining. Multiple seismologists interviewed in the immediate aftermath made a version of the same point that a magnitude 7. 4. Earthquake at this specific depth, while still catastrophic, did not level entire cities outright specifically, because so much of that raw energy dissipated on its long journey up through 60-plus miles of rock before it ever reached street level. Scientists have also been working through exactly what specific mechanism caused this particular rupture, and while the investigation is still ongoing, the leading explanations point toward processes happening entirely within the subducting slab itself rather than at the plate interface. Colombia's Geological Service pointed specifically to stress building up inside the Nazca Plate as it continues its descent, and one widely discussed hypothesis involves a process where increasing pressure and temperature deep within the sinking slab causes water-bearing minerals trapped in the rock to release fluid, a process that raises pore pressure within surrounding rock, and can trigger exactly this kind of internal rupture, independent of whatever's happening at the shallow boundary between the two plates. Independent earthquake scientist Amilcar Carrera Cevallos, speaking to Scientific American in the immediate aftermath, noted that the rupture appeared to involve strike-slip motion, blocks of crust sliding horizontally past each other deep within the slab, rather than the more typical thrusting motion associated with shallow subduction earthquakes. And he made a point worth remembering, that this kind of deep internal stress release represents a recurring, ongoing process within this specific stretch of the subducting Nazca Plate, not some one-time anomaly that suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Colombian civil engineer and seismologist Gina Villalobos echoed that framing directly, telling local media that this earthquake reflects entirely normal behavior for the tectonic plates operating in this region, behavior that has nothing to do with human activity, the season, or any other outside factor, simply the ordinary, if devastating, physics of a plate boundary that happens to sit directly beneath one of South America's most densely populated regions. It's worth pausing here to directly address a comparison that came up almost immediately across international coverage, because the timing genuinely does invite it. Colombia's earthquake struck less than 7 weeks after Venezuela. Its immediate neighbor was devastated by a sequence of 2 massive earthquakes back in June, and watching search teams once again picking through collapsed buildings in a South American capital so soon, after an eerily similar scene played out next door, naturally raises the question of whether these 2 disasters are connected. Colombia's own geological service addressed that question directly and was unambiguous in its answer. There is no connection between the 2 events, because they result from fundamentally different tectonic dynamics. The Venezuelan earthquakes were shallow, strike-slip ruptures tied to the lateral shearing interaction between the Caribbean and South American plates, the same broad category of transform fault motion that produces earthquakes along something like California's San Andreas Fault. Colombia's earthquake, as we just walked through, was an intermediate depth event occurring more than 100 kilometers down, inside the subducting Nazca Plate, an entirely separate mechanism driven by an entirely separate plate boundary. Colombian seismologist Viviana Dionisio, with the country's National Seismological Network, made the distinction explicit in comments to the press, describing the 2 disasters as illustrating their independence from each other, rather than any shared underlying cause. It's a genuinely important clarification because, in the panic and grief following back-to-back South American earthquake disasters within the same summer, it would be easy to assume some larger, connected process is unfolding across the continent, when the reality is that this specific stretch of the planet simply sits atop several independently active fault systems, each one capable of producing a major, headline-generating disaster on its own schedule, without any of them needing to trigger or influence the others. It's also worth putting this earthquake in its proper Colombian historical context, because the country is no stranger to devastating seismic events, even if this particular one stands out for its specific characteristics. The earthquake has already been described by multiple outlets and confirmed by Colombia's own geological service as the strongest the country has experienced in the 21st century, and its strongest in at least the past decade. The most frequently invoked historical comparison is the earthquake that struck near the city of Armenia in January of 1999, a magnitude 6. 2 event that, despite its comparatively smaller magnitude, killed more than 1,100 people, largely because it struck at a shallow depth directly beneath a densely populated urban area with widespread construction that hadn't been built to modern seismic standards. That disaster remains a defining generational trauma across the same coffee-growing region hit hardest by this month's earthquake, and it directly shaped much of Colombia's subsequent seismic building code reform. Further back, a magnitude 6. 4 earthquake in June of 1994 triggered a massive landslide that wiped out several indigenous villages in the mountains of southern Colombia, killing more than 1,100 people in a disaster whose exact final toll was never fully established, given how many victims were buried under the resulting landslide debris rather than recovered. And even Pereira, specifically, the city that has recorded the highest death toll from this month's earthquake, has its own painful history with this exact hazard, a magnitude 6. 2 earthquake, back in February of 1995, killed at least 28 people in the city, flattening apartment buildings in scenes that read as an almost uncanny preview of what unfolded again this August, more than 3 decades later. Colombia sits squarely on the Pacific Ring of Fire, and the reality its seismologists have long emphasized is that small background tremors are simply a routine part of daily life in the central and western parts of the country, while earthquakes above magnitude 6, though comparatively rare, carry a well-established, repeatedly proven track record of producing exactly this kind of mass casualty disaster whenever they strike near a population center. Understanding why the destruction concentrated so heavily in specific cities requires looking at both the geology and the built environment together, because neither factor alone explains what happened. The Coffee Axis region hit hardest by this earthquake, encompassing Pereira, Armenia, Manizales, and the surrounding departments, sits in mountainous, volcanically influenced terrain, much of it built on the kind of loose, complex soil common to steep Andean valleys, soil that can behave very differently under strong shaking than the more uniform ground found in flatter regions. Add to that the reality that a significant share of the region's building stock, particularly older residential apartment towers and commercial buildings constructed before Colombia's more rigorous post-1999 seismic code reforms took full effect, was never engineered to withstand shaking of this intensity. And you get a combination that turns even a deep, energy-dampened earthquake like this one into a genuinely catastrophic event for the specific structures unlucky enough to have been built before those standards existed or built without full compliance, even after the codes changed. Colombia did significantly strengthen its national seismic building code following the 1999 Armenia disaster, introducing far stricter requirements for reinforced concrete design, foundation engineering, and retrofit standards for older structures. And those reforms are widely credited with having prevented an even higher death toll this time around, especially in newer construction. But building code reform in Colombia, just as in every other seismically active country in the world, only protects the buildings actually constructed or retrofitted under the new rules, and the scenes of collapse captured across Pereira, Cali, and Manizales overwhelmingly involve older structures that predate the strongest of those reforms, a painful but familiar pattern that shows up again and again whenever a major earthquake strikes a region with a large existing stock of older, non-compliant buildings. It's worth going a little deeper into the specific tectonic neighborhood this earthquake came from, because Colombia's relationship with intermediate depth earthquakes like this one isn't a new or unfamiliar phenomenon to the country's seismologists, even if it caught much of the public off guard. Roughly 200 kilometers southeast of where this month's rupture occurred, in Colombia's Cauca region, sits one of the most unusual and closely studied seismic features anywhere on the planet, a cluster of earthquakes occurring at depths between about 80 and 160 kilometers within the mantle wedge sitting above the subducting Nazca slab, an area seismologists have been documenting for decades, precisely because it produces such an unusually high concentration of deep, non-interface earthquakes for a subduction zone of this type. That broader pattern of intraslab seismicity, earthquakes born from stress and fracturing happening within the descending plate itself, rather than at the boundary between two plates, is a well-established, recurring feature of how this particular stretch of the Nazca plate behaves as it continues its multi-million-year journey beneath the South American continent. Recognizing that pattern matters enormously for how Colombian seismologists think about future risk, because it means this month's earthquake wasn't some singular, unprecedented anomaly bursting out of otherwise quiet ground. It was a large expression of a genuinely ongoing, well-documented seismic process specific to this exact stretch of subducting oceanic crust, one capable of producing earthquakes of this style and depth again in the future, on a timeline nobody can currently predict with precision. The international emergency response that mobilized in the days immediately following the earthquake also illustrates just how standardized and, in some ways, well-rehearsed this kind of large-scale disaster response has become across the international community, even though every individual earthquake presents its own unique logistical puzzle. Specialized urban search and rescue teams, the kind trained specifically to locate survivors trapped within collapsed reinforced concrete structures using acoustic listening equipment, trained rescue dogs, and small, maneuverable cameras capable of threading through gaps in rubble too narrow and unstable for a human rescuer to enter safely, are among the first specialized resources that neighboring countries and international relief networks typically offer in the earliest hours after a disaster of this scale, precisely because that specific expertise, working within that critical 72-hour survival window, can make the difference between a trapped survivor being found alive or not. Colombia's own military and civil defense apparatus, built up over decades of dealing with both this kind of natural disaster and the country's long-running internal security challenges, brought considerable existing capacity to the initial response. But disasters of this scale, spanning multiple major cities simultaneously and disrupting infrastructure across 9 separate departments, routinely exceed what any single national response system can handle entirely on its own, which is exactly why coordination with neighboring countries and established international humanitarian networks becomes such a critical part of the response within the first several days, even as Colombian authorities retain overall command of the operation on their own soil. The emergency response itself has unfolded on a genuinely massive scale, and it's worth walking through what that actually looks like on the ground, because the scope of what's required after an earthquake like this extends far beyond the immediate rescue of people trapped in collapsed buildings. Within hours of the quake, President de la Espriella, in what became the first major crisis of his newly installed administration, announced he was personally taking charge of the national response, a significant statement given that his presidency had begun only the day before, and one that placed an immediate high-stakes test in front of a leader who had campaigned largely on promises around public safety and crime rather than disaster management. Colombia's Civil Aviation Authority moved quickly to suspend operations at the 7 regional airports serving the hardest-hit departments, a necessary precaution to allow engineers time to inspect runways, control towers, and terminal buildings for structural damage before resuming flights that would be essential for bringing in additional rescue personnel, medical supplies, and equipment. On the ground, the search and rescue effort has drawn together an enormous combined force: national police, military units, professional firefighters, and, in scene after scene captured on video and described by residents, ordinary civilians working alongside trained rescue crews, forming the kind of spontaneous human chains through rubble fields that have become such a recognizable feature of major urban earthquake disasters around the world. Officials have confirmed that basic infrastructure across the hardest-hit areas has been seriously disrupted. Hospitals, roads, aqueducts, energy networks, and telecommunications have all sustained damage severe enough to complicate the broader relief effort, meaning rescue teams in some of the more remote or mountainous affected communities have had to work without reliable communication back to Central Command, without guaranteed road access, and in some cases without functioning local hospitals, to bring survivors to once they're pulled from the rubble. At least 21 aftershocks were recorded within the first several hours following the main shock alone, a genuinely significant number that has kept both rescue workers and residents on edge, since aftershocks of a large intermediate depth earthquake, while typically less destructive than the main event, still carry the very real danger of bringing down already weakened structures that survive the initial shaking. It's also useful to place this specific intermediate depth earthquake in a wider global context, because Colombia is far from the only country whose most dangerous earthquakes come not from the shallow, headline-familiar plate boundaries most people picture, but from deep within a subducting slab many decades or centuries after that slab first sinks below the coastline. Similar intermediate and deep focus earthquakes occur regularly beneath other stretches of the Pacific Ring of Fire, where oceanic plates are actively subducting, including beneath parts of Peru, Chile, and Bolivia, where some of the deepest earthquakes ever recorded anywhere on the planet, hundreds of kilometers down, have been documented for decades without producing the kind of surface rupture or tsunami associated with shallower events. What makes Colombia's situation this month so devastating, despite the very same depth-related energy dissipation that seismologists credit with limiting the destruction compared to what a shallow quake of equal magnitude would have caused, is simply the sheer number of people living directly above this specific stretch of active slab, concentrated in mountainous valley cities built up over generations without the geological luxury of relocating away from an inherently active tectonic neighborhood. That combination, a well-understood, scientifically unsurprising seismic mechanism colliding with dense human settlement built up over more than a century, is really the through line connecting this disaster to nearly every other major earthquake catastrophe covered in the news in recent memory, from Venezuela earlier this summer to events on entirely different fault systems halfway around the world. The geology itself rarely does anything scientists find genuinely shocking. The tragedy comes from how many people and how much infrastructure sit directly in its path when it finally lets go. There's also a genuinely important, practical dimension to how a disaster like this reshapes public conversation in its immediate aftermath, one that Colombia is already visibly working through in real time. Major earthquake disasters routinely trigger, almost immediately, a surge of public and political attention toward exactly the kind of building code enforcement and retrofit funding questions that tend to receive far less attention during ordinary quiet years between major seismic events. Colombia's post-1999 code reforms are frequently cited as a genuine success story in disaster risk reduction circles, specifically because they were sustained over more than 2 decades, rather than fading from political priority once the immediate memory of the Armenia disaster receded, and the relatively better performance of the country's newest reinforced concrete construction during this month's earthquake, compared to the older buildings that dominate the list of collapses in Pereira and Cali, offers a genuinely useful, if painful, real-world data point supporting that same continued investment going forward. Whether this earthquake produces a similar multi-decade wave of renewed enforcement and retrofit funding, the way the 1999 disaster did, or whether attention fades more quickly this time, is a genuinely open question that will only become clear over the coming years. And it's precisely the kind of long-term, unglamorous policy follow-through that ultimately determines how much worse or how much better the next major earthquake striking this exact region turns out to be. There's a particular kind of agony built into disasters like this one that's worth acknowledging directly, because it shapes everything about how the coming days and weeks will unfold for the families affected. In the immediate aftermath of any major earthquake, rescue teams operate under what's often called the golden window, the first 72 hours or so after a building collapse, when the odds of finding survivors still trapped in voids and pockets within the rubble remain meaningfully higher, before dehydration, injury, and the physical strain of confinement make survival increasingly unlikely. That window is why the scenes of civilians and professional rescuers working side by side through the rubble in Cali and Pereira in these first days matter so enormously. And it's also why the missing persons count, sitting above 3,700 as of the most recent tally, carries such weight, because that number represents both a genuine tragedy already unfolding and a population of people whose fate, in many individual cases, still genuinely hangs in the balance as search crews continue working through debris field after debris field. Colombian officials have been direct in stating that these figures, the death toll, the injury count, and especially the missing persons total, are provisional and expected to keep changing, in some cases rising further, as rescue crews finally reach villages that have been completely isolated since the earthquake struck, cut off by landslides, collapsed roads, or simply the sheer difficulty of traveling through mountainous Andean terrain when the normal transportation network has been severely damaged. Stepping back from the immediate crisis, it's worth talking honestly about what a disaster like this typically means for the weeks and months that follow, because the emergency phase captured in the headlines right now is only the first chapter of what's usually a much longer recovery. International aid coordination, of the kind already being discussed among neighboring countries and international relief organizations, typically ramps up significantly in the days immediately following an earthquake of this scale, bringing in specialized urban search and rescue teams trained specifically in locating survivors within collapsed, reinforced concrete structures, along with heavy engineering equipment capable of safely lifting and clearing debris without risking further collapse onto anyone who might still be alive underneath. Structural engineers will spend weeks, in some cases months, methodically inspecting every building across the affected departments that didn't collapse outright but sustained visible or hidden damage. A painstaking building-by-building process that ultimately determines which structures can be safely reoccupied, which need extensive retrofitting before anyone moves back in, and which will need to be demolished entirely. For a region as economically important as Colombia's coffee axis, an area whose agricultural output and cultural significance make it one of the country's genuine economic engines, the recovery process will also involve difficult questions about how quickly damaged infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, power networks can be restored well enough to support both daily life and the region's broader economic activity. Questions that tend to stretch on for months after the initial emergency response winds down and international attention inevitably moves elsewhere. There's also a broader, harder conversation this disaster is already forcing Colombia to confront, one that echoes almost every major earthquake disaster anywhere in the world. And it centers on the uncomfortable gap between what building codes require on paper and what actually gets built and maintained in practice. Colombia's seismic code reforms following the 1999 Armenia earthquake were genuinely significant, bringing the country's standards for new reinforced concrete construction much closer in line with international best practice. And those reforms almost certainly saved lives this time around in buildings constructed or seriously retrofitted since then. But as the specific pattern of destruction across Pereira, Cali, and Manizales makes painfully clear, a code only protects the structures actually built under it. And the persistent challenge facing Colombia, just as it faces every earthquake-prone country with a large existing stock of older buildings, is the immense cost and logistical difficulty of retrofitting decades' worth of pre-code construction fast enough to meaningfully reduce risk before the next major earthquake strikes. That's precisely the same structural challenge researchers have flagged in seismically active regions across the world, from the central United States to the Mediterranean, a hazard that's genuinely well understood by scientists and engineers, paired with a retrofit and preparedness gap that tends to close far more slowly than the underlying geological clock keeps ticking. For anyone watching this who has family, friends, or any personal connection to the affected region right now, the most useful and immediate thing to know is that Colombia's official disaster response agencies and the Association of Capital Cities have been publishing regular updated casualty and status reports as search operations continue, and that international relief organizations, including established groups with existing operations across Latin America, are actively coordinating support for exactly this kind of large-scale emergency response. If you're in a position to help verified, established humanitarian organizations with a direct operational presence in Colombia, remain the most effective route for getting support to where it's actually needed on the ground. And if you're watching this because you're personally affected, because you have loved ones in Pereira, Cali, Manizales, Armenia, or any of the surrounding communities still working through the aftermath of this earthquake, we recognize this is an enormously difficult, frightening time, and we hope the people you're waiting to hear from are found safe. This is a story that is still very much unfolding, and every number in this video, the death toll, the injury count, the missing persons figure, the count of collapsed and damaged buildings, should be understood as a snapshot of where things stood at the moment this was written, rather than a final accounting of what this disaster ultimately cost. Colombia's Geological Service and the broader international seismological community will continue refining the scientific picture of exactly what happened deep within the Nazca Plate on the morning of August 10th in the weeks ahead, publishing more detailed analyses of the rupture mechanics, the aftershock sequence, and the specific fault or faults involved. Colombian officials will continue the difficult, painstaking work of search and rescue, structural assessment, and eventually reconstruction across a region that will be dealing with the consequences of this single morning for months, and, in the case of the hardest hit communities, likely years to come. If you found this breakdown useful, drop a comment and let us know your thoughts. And if you have any connection to the Coffee Axis region or Western Colombia more broadly, we'd genuinely like to hear how you and your community are doing as this situation continues to develop. Share this with anyone you know following the news out of Colombia right now, because a clear, accurate understanding of what actually happened and why matters enormously at a moment when misinformation tends to spread just as quickly as the real reporting during any major disaster. And if you want to keep following how both the search and rescue effort and the broader scientific understanding of this earthquake develop in the days ahead, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next update the moment new, verified information comes in. Thank you for watching this one all the way through, and our thoughts remain with everyone across Colombia working through the aftermath of this earthquake right now, the rescue workers still searching through the rubble, the families still waiting for word on missing loved ones, and the entire country now facing the long road of recovery that lies ahead.